The wind rolled across the vast plains, carrying the scent of dry grass and the faint temps of livestock. The sun had just dipped behind the distant hills, casting long shadows over the sprawling ranch. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, his silhouette outlined by the fading light. He dismounted at the edge of the main house, dust clinging to his boots. This ranch had been in his family for generations, a place where wealth and power were measured by the size of the land, the number of cattle, and the sharpness of one's instincts.
But
tonight something was different. Tonight, he wasn't just a rancher. He was a man with a question, a test, and a curiosity he could no longer ignore. Inside the main house, the kitchen was quiet, except for the soft crackle of the fireplace. A single candle flickered, throwing dancing shadows across the wooden walls. A poor widow moved carefully around the small room, her hands rough from years of labor, her clothes patched but neat. She hummed a tune that seemed to belong to another era, a melody that carried the memory of better days. Despite the hardships she had endured, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, the kind that spoke of resilience rather than despair. She had come to this town alone, after losing everything she held dear, and had found work wherever she could, mending clothes, cooking meals, tending to small tasks for the neighbors. Life had taught her caution, but it had not yet taught her fear of men who wielded power like a weapon. The rancher lingered outside the kitchen door, watching her from the shadows. He was known in these parts as a man who had everything: money, land, influence, but he had also earned a reputation for being meticulous, almost calculating in the way he studied people. He had seen too many pretenses, too many smiles that hid selfish intentions, and he wanted to see the truth of this widow for himself. There was a story going around the town about her honesty, about the way she treated those in need without asking for anything in return. People spoke of her kindness as if it were a rare jewel in a world grown harsh. The rancher wanted to know if it was true. He stepped quietly into the house, careful to make no sound. The widow did not notice him at first, too absorbed in cleaning the hearth and arranging her meager belongings. He sat down in the corner of the room, positioning himself so that she could not see him clearly, and leaned back as if resting after a long day. He closed his eyes, letting out a deliberate sigh that suggested he was already asleep. Every muscle in his body was still, every breath measured, every movement calculated. He was testing her, and he knew the smallest reaction would tell him more than any words could. The widow paused for a moment, her hands frozen in midair. There was a tension in the room, a sense that something unseen had shifted. She glanced toward the corner where the man sat, her instincts whispering caution, but the shadows and dim candlelight made it impossible to be sure. She resumed her work, but her movements were softer, more careful, as if aware of an audience she could not see. She hummed again, a low, steady tune meant to soothe herself as much as anyone else. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of a distant whistle, a sound that belonged to no one in particular, but seemed to mark the passing of time. Inside, the widow went about her chores, her back straight, her eyes focused, her mind alert to the unknown. She had lived through loss, hunger, and loneliness, but she had never faced a situation like this, where the weight of observation pressed upon her without a single word being spoken. She sensed that something significant was at stake, though she could not name it. The rancher's eyes opened just slightly, enough to catch the glimmer of her reflection in the kitchen window. He watched as she moved, noting the precision in her steps, the care in the way she handled her tools and utensils. He saw honesty in her posture, a natural grace that came from living in truth rather than pretense. There was something magnetic in the way she worked, something that commanded respect without demanding it. He realized that this was not a woman who would easily be deceived or manipulated, a realization that both intrigued and unsettled him. As the evening wore on, shadows deepened, and the flicker of the candle grew steadier. The widow finished tending the fire and began to prepare a small meal. She worked silently, her mind wandering to memories of her late husband, of the days when laughter filled the rooms now quiet. She set the table for one, assuming solitude, and aware that the quiet observer in the corner was counting every careful movement, every unspoken thought reflected in her eyes. A sudden noise from outside startled her, a branch scraping against the side of the house. Her hand moved instinctively toward a small knife hanging on the wall. Her muscles tensed for a moment, but then relaxed as the sound passed. The rancher noticed her alertness and the way she controlled her fear, masking it with calm. It confirmed what he had suspected. She had endured hardship and emerged stronger, not weaker, for it. Night deepened, and the widow finally moved toward the small bed she had made in the corner of the room. She laid out a blanket and pillow, her movements slow and deliberate, signaling the end of her day. The rancher, still pretending to sleep, allowed himself to observe her from this intimate distance. He was looking for more than honesty, he was looking for heart, for the small, often unseen truths that could not be faked. And in the quiet of that room, lit only by the soft glow of a dying candle, he began to see something he had not anticipated. Vulnerability wrapped in strength, grief tempered by resilience, and a spirit that refused to be broken. Yet, just as he was beginning to understand her, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. What if he had misread her? What if her kindness was a mask, like so many others he had encountered? He remained still, holding his breath, waiting for the moment that would reveal the truth. The widow sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap. Staring into the fire as if seeking answers she could not name, she sensed a presence, a tension she could not explain, yet she could not pinpoint it. The room seemed to shrink and expand at once, the silence growing heavy with unspoken questions. The rancher, feeling the weight of her attention even though she did not look directly at him, realized he had underestimated the depth of the situation. This was not simply a test, it was a revelation waiting to happen. Suddenly, the widow spoke, though not to him. Her words were soft, almost a whisper, a confession to the empty room. "If only someone could understand what it means to carry this alone," she said. Her voice, fragile, yet resolute, carried a weight that reached across the room and settled in the rancher's chest. He remained still, letting her words sink in, each syllable a mirror reflecting a life he had never known but had always sought to understand. The candle flickered one last time before dimming to a soft glow. The rancher's eyes widened slightly as he realized he was no longer just an observer. He had become part of the story, entwined with the life of a widow who had faced unimaginable hardships, yet refused to be defeated. What he saw challenged everything he thought he knew about people, about kindness, and about the quiet strength that often went unnoticed. He leaned back against the wall, heart pounding, wondering how a single night could change the way he viewed everything around him. Outside, the wind whispered across the plains, carrying secrets he was only beginning to understand. And in that small, dimly lit room, two lives hovered on the edge of discovery. Teetering between trust and caution, between fear and hope, the night stretched on, and the rancher remained still. Eyes half closed, breath steady, as he waited for the moment that would confirm what he already suspected. But even in the silence, the answer was not yet clear, and the widow, unaware of the man's vigil, drifted closer to sleep. Unaware that her life and his understanding of the world was about to be changed forever, the widow stirred slightly. Her eyes half closed as sleep began to tug at her, but the quiet presence in the room kept her senses alert. There was something in the air, a subtle tension that she couldn't name. Years of surviving on her own had taught her to trust instinct, and though she had no proof of anyone being there, her hands twitched toward the edge of the blanket. She had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself and that even kind intentions could hide sharp edges. The rancher remained perfectly still, leaning back as if he truly were asleep, but his mind raced. He had watched the widow long enough to know that appearances could be deceptive. Yet everything he had seen so far, the careful way she handled her chores, the dignity with which she carried herself, spoke louder than any story the townsfolk might whisper. He had expected weakness, vulnerability, or fear. Instead, he had found strength tempered by hardship, a quiet bravery that left him both intrigued and unsettled. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant sounds of the ranch at night. Outside, the wind shifted and the loose boards of the porch creaked. The rancher's eyes tracked each subtle movement, noting the widow's reactions, measuring her awareness. She remained unaware of how closely she was observed, yet there was an almost magnetic energy in the room, an invisible thread tying the observer to the observed. He began to think of her life before she had come to this town, piecing together the fragments of the person she was through the clues she left in her small home. The hands that worked so carefully, the faint calluses and scars, told stories of labor and loss. The faded dress she wore, patched at the hem and cuff, suggested a life once more comfortable, now stripped to necessity. The widow's eyes, though softened by weariness, carried a glint of memory, a reflection of someone who had once known happiness and had been forced to leave it behind. The rancher wondered what had brought her here, why fate had led her to this modest cabin on the edge of his land. Was it loss that drove her, or determination? Or perhaps a mixture of both, tangled together until it became impossible to separate. He thought of the stories townsfolk shared about widows, some exaggerated, some cautionary tales meant to warn young men, but none of them seemed to capture the quiet dignity this woman exuded. She was not a figure of pity. She was something else entirely. A mystery wrapped in the simplest of gestures, a presence that demanded attention without a word. The widow, meanwhile, settled more firmly onto her blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders as if it could shield her from more than the night chill. Her mind wandered back to the days before the fire had taken her home, before the illness had taken her husband, and before she had been left with only memories and small tasks to sustain herself. Each memory was sharp, vivid, and painful, yet there was a lesson embedded in them, that life was as unforgiving as it was fleeting, and only those who endured could claim any measure of peace. She did not realize that someone was studying these very memories reflected in her posture, in the way her fingers absently traced the folds of the blanket. The rancher's curiosity deepened. He had lived among people for years, yet he had rarely encountered anyone like her. There was a purity to her strength, a natural integrity that defied his usual assumptions about survival. He knew instinctively that she had secrets, yet those secrets were not hidden by deception. They were layered like the land itself, buried beneath hardship and experience, waiting for the right person to uncover them. He thought about his own life, a life of inherited wealth, of decisions made for him before he even understood the weight of consequence. On paper, he had everything, yet he had always suspected that the measure of a person could not be found in gold or acres. It was in moments like this, when observation revealed truth, when the ordinary actions of another human being carried more weight than any ledger or title. He had come to see her as more than a widow. She was a puzzle, one that demanded patience, careful attention, and respect. Outside, the night carried sounds of coyotes calling in the distance, the low whistle of wind through the grass, and the occasional creak of a gate swinging in the ranch yard. The widow's ears picked up the faintest movements, yet she remained calm, accustomed to living with uncertainty. The rancher noticed the steadiness in her breathing, the controlled rhythm that betrayed someone who had learned discipline in the harshest ways. He allowed himself a small thought, unspoken, almost forbidden. Perhaps she was the kind of person who could change everything he had believed about people, about kindness, about trust. And yet he could not afford to let the thought fully form. To admit it too soon would ruin the test he had set for himself. The observation that had begun as curiosity and was now bordering on revelation. The widow shifted, glancing toward the corner of the room where shadows lay thick. She felt a presence more strongly than she could explain, a sense that she was not entirely alone. Yet she could not pinpoint why or who. An instinct told her to remain composed rather than confront the unknown. Her life had taught her that calm observation was often more effective than reaction. She settled back, drawing her knees close to her chest, and let the fire's warmth chase away the chill in her bones. The rancher's mind wandered to the moments that might follow. If she discovered him now, what would she think? Fear, anger, or understanding? He wanted to witness her truth before introducing himself, to see the widow's genuine self without influence, without any change brought by awareness of observation. There was something almost sacred in watching another human being act from instinct, from the raw core of who they were. Time stretched, the night folding into itself, until even the fire seemed to dim under the weight of suspense. The rancher felt the quiet thrill of anticipation, tempered by the respect he had developed for the widow. Each tick of the clock, each creak of the house, each subtle movement she made only deepened the mystery. He realized that in this room, in the smallest gestures and silent decisions, he was witnessing a story far richer than any he had encountered in the halls of wealth or the gossip of townsfolk. And yet, as the night deepened, the rancher could not shake a sense of unease. There was more to her than mere survival, more to her presence than the quiet dignity he had observed. Something lingered beneath the surface, a past that had shaped her. Choices she had made, losses that had scarred her but not broken her. He did not know the details, yet he sensed the weight of them, a force as potent as any he had felt on his ranch, as powerful as any storm that swept the plains. The widow finally rested her head against the blanket, closing her eyes for a moment, yet sleep came fitfully. Her mind remained alert, scanning the shadows, listening for any hint that the night might bring unwelcome surprises. Her heart carried the stories of days long gone, yet it also held a fragile hope, the faint notion that life, even in its harshest form, could still bring unexpected moments of grace. The rancher watched, unmoving, as the widow's eyes fluttered open and closed. He sensed the turning point approaching, the moment when the quiet balance of observation would tip into revelation. He did not yet know how or when it would happen, only that it would. And when it did, it would change the story of both their lives in ways neither could fully predict. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the distant cry of a lone hawk, a sound that seemed to mark the passing of time and the weight of destiny. The rancher's eyes remained half-closed, his ears attuned to every sound, his mind racing with questions that had no answers yet. He had come seeking truth, and now he realized that truth was far more complex than he had imagined. A mixture of hardship, resilience, and quiet strength that could not be measured by wealth or position. The widow shifted again, unaware of the silent witness in the corner, unaware that her life was being seen in ways she could not yet understand. Her hands rested on the blanket, her fingers tracing absent patterns, her breath steady despite the lingering tension. The room was filled with a delicate balance, the unspoken connection between observer and observed. And the night stretched on, heavy with expectation. The rancher's thoughts lingered on what he had seen so far, yet he knew he had only glimpsed the surface. There were depths to this woman he could not yet reach, stories hidden behind quiet gestures, truths concealed beneath layers of endurance. He would wait, patient and silent, until the moment came when the widow would reveal more than circumstance ever allowed. And in that waiting, he felt a strange mixture of anticipation, respect, and an uneasy awareness that his own life might never be the same once the truth was fully revealed. The fire crackled low, casting a final flicker across the room. Outside, the plains stretched endlessly under the watch of the stars. Inside, two lives remained poised at the edge of discovery, one aware, one observing, both bound by a tension that promised change. And as the night deepened, neither could predict what the coming hours would bring. Only that the test, the observation, and the quiet suspense were far from over. Morning arrived slowly, the sunlight spilling over the hills in pale gold and washing the plains in warmth. The widow stirred, stretching her arms as if testing the limits of her own strength. She had slept fitfully, dreams tangled with memories she could not fully escape. The small cabin smelled faintly of the fire from the previous night, the lingering aroma of bread and stew, reminding her of the tiny comforts she had carved from her hard life. She rose carefully, wary of creaking floorboards and the quiet of the early morning. The rancher had not moved. He remained in the corner where he had positioned himself the night before, watching her with a measured gaze. He was no longer pretending to sleep, but he had not yet revealed his presence. He wanted to see her first moments of the day, to understand how she approached life when no one was looking. There was a subtle strength in her routine, a resilience that had been honed by hardship, yet tempered by small moments of hope. She allowed herself in private. The widow hummed softly, as if the tune could shield her from the uncertainty she felt lingering in the shadows. She moved to fetch water from the small jug at the corner of the room, careful not to spill a single drop. Every action was deliberate, yet there was a natural grace in it, a rhythm that suggested experience without arrogance. She had learned to survive, yes, but she had also learned to live quietly with dignity. And that balance intrigued the rancher more than any act of bravery he could have imagined. As she prepared a modest breakfast, the rancher's mind wandered to the land he had inherited, the vast expanse of his ranch, and the network of people who lived and worked on it. There was loyalty, yes, but also envy and hidden agendas. He had come to understand that appearances were often misleading, that even the kindest gestures could mask ambition. He had tested many, observed more, and yet this widow was different. She was not only honest in her work, but she carried herself with a confidence that did not seek recognition. That was rare, and it made him both curious and cautious. Outside, the plains stretched under the rising sun, a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving. A neighboring rancher rode past on horseback, tipping his hat to no one in particular, unaware of the quiet drama unfolding in the widow's cabin. The widow herself glanced briefly out the window, noting the familiar sight of dust and distance. But her focus quickly returned to her chores. She could not afford distractions, not when life had taught her that a moment of carelessness could cost dearly. The rancher's eyes followed her every move. He noticed the way she handled each task, the subtle shifts in expression, the way she seemed to calculate effort against necessity. He began to wonder about the full extent of her story, about the moments she had survived alone, and the people who had left her in this place. There was a complexity in her existence, layers hidden beneath a calm exterior, and he wanted to unravel them carefully, without forcing her hand. A sudden knock at the door startled both of them, though the widow alone reacted immediately. She moved toward it cautiously, placing a hand on the worn wooden latch. Her fingers tightened slightly around the handle as if preparing for any eventuality. The rancher noted the instinctive caution, the alertness shaped by years of vigilance. When she opened the door, a young boy appeared, no more than 10, with a messenger's satchel slung over his shoulder. His eyes darted nervously, and he hesitated before speaking. "Ma'am," he said, voice trembling slightly, "there's word from the town. Folks say someone's been asking questions about you, about where you came from." He shifted uncomfortably, as if afraid to reveal too much. "They didn't mean any harm, ma'am, but, well, some of the questions weren't friendly." The widow's expression hardened, though her voice remained calm. "Questions are only dangerous if you answer them carelessly, boy," who asked. "And why?" And the boy swallowed, then looked toward the corner of the room instinctively, as if sensing another presence he could not see. "They didn't say much, just that. People are curious," he admitted. "They said you've been keeping to yourself, and some folks, they don't like that. They think it's strange for a widow to live alone and work without asking help." The widow's eyes narrowed. There had been suspicion before, but this hinted at something more deliberate, something that could unravel the fragile peace she had built. She thanked the boy, handing him a few coins from her small stash, and sent him on his way with careful instructions to speak no further. The rancher observed silently, noting the tension in her shoulders, the steady control in her voice, and the way she had managed the situation without panic. It was then that he realized there was more at stake than he had anticipated. The widow was not only guarding her own life, but she was also defending the dignity she had cultivated in a world that often sought to strip it away. And for the first time, the rancher considered what it might mean to involve himself. Up until now, he had observed. But if the small town's curiosity threatened her safety or peace, could he remain merely a watcher, or would he be forced to act? The widow went about her day, tending a small garden behind the cabin, kicking a few chickens, and performing simple repairs. Each movement spoke of self-reliance and care, yet there was a watchfulness underlying every step. She knew the town was beginning to whisper, and she knew how dangerous idle gossip could be. The rancher's presence made no difference to her outward composure, but he saw the slight tension in her jaw, the way her eyes flickered to the door, the calculated pauses in her work. She was constantly measuring, assessing, guarding not just her body but her history, her story, the life she had painstakingly rebuilt. As the day wore on, a second visitor arrived, a woman from the nearby settlement, older and sharp-eyed, who had once known the widow in passing. She greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, her voice carrying a subtle edge. "I heard you've been living out here alone," she said. "Most women in your place, they don't last long without family or help. How do you manage?" The widow's reply was calm but firm. "I manage because I have to. The world doesn't wait for anyone to feel ready. You adapt, or you don't survive." She returned to her work, letting the statement hang in the air, heavy with meaning. The older woman regarded her silently for a moment, perhaps sensing that she had underestimated the widow's strength. She departed without another word, leaving an unspoken question lingering in the air. What had this woman endured to reach this point? The rancher leaned forward slightly in his corner, absorbing each interaction, noting the way the widow handled intrusion, scrutiny, and potential threats. He saw the threads of conflict weaving around her, the town's curiosity, the whispers that could turn to judgment, the risk of isolation, or worse. And he realized that the test he had begun was no longer simply about honesty, it was about courage, resilience, and the quiet defiance of a life shaped by hardship. Evening fell again, the light softening across the plains, and the widow returned to the cabin. She lit a fire and moved about, preparing a modest supper, her mind occupied with the events of the day. Outside, the wind rustled through the tall grasses, carrying the faint sounds of the ranch beyond her property, sounds that reminded her she was never entirely alone. She paused for a moment, glancing toward the shadowed corner where the rancher still observed, his presence a silent question she could not yet answer. The rancher, in turn, felt the weight of the day pressing upon him. He had seen the widow navigate small but significant conflicts, and each moment revealed more about her character, her history, and the way she carried herself in a world that often sought to diminish her. He understood that the town's scrutiny was only the beginning, that the true challenges she faced were the ones rooted in her past, in choices she had made and loss she had endured. And he knew that when the moment came to reveal himself, it would not be simple. The balance of trust, respect, and honesty was delicate, and he had little room for error. The widow sat at her table, quietly eating, aware that the night was settling in, aware that tension still lingered in ways she could not name. The rancher's eyes followed her every move, understanding more each hour that the story unfolding here was not just about wealth, curiosity, or testing it, was about survival, integrity, and the courage to face the world as it truly was. And in that quiet, dimly lit room, both lives waited, poised on the edge of discovery, neither knowing exactly when the next thread of truth would unravel the fragile balance between observer and observed. Outside, the plains stretched endlessly, the wind carrying the whispers of the land, the distant sounds of life and livestock, and the subtle echo of questions that had yet to be answered. The widow remained vigilant, and the rancher remained patient, both caught in a delicate tension that promised revelation, conflict, and change, but not yet resolution. Night had settled fully over the plains, the moon casting a pale glow across the ranch and the widow's small cabin. The air was still, heavy with anticipation, as if the land itself held its breath. Inside, the widow moved quietly, attending to chores she had done countless times before, yet tonight every step carried weight. She sensed something different in the air, a tension she could not name, a presence that lingered just beyond her awareness. Her instincts, honed through years of hardship, whispered caution. The rancher remained in his corner, leaning against the wall with his eyes open, observing every motion, every subtle expression. He had followed her through the day, noting how she handled small intrusions, how she maintained calm under scrutiny, and how her mind always seemed to be several steps ahead of any potential threat. He realized that the test he had devised had become something more. It was no longer a simple observation of honesty. It had grown into a study of courage, resilience, and survival under pressure. Outside, the wind shifted suddenly, carrying a faint sound footsteps on the path leading to the cabin. The widow froze, her hand instinctively moving toward the latch of the door. The footsteps paused, then continued, slow and deliberate. She held her breath, listening, alert and ready for anything. The rancher's gaze sharpened. He knew that the arrival of another person could change everything in an instant, and the tension in the room became almost tangible. A shadow appeared in the doorway, and a man's voice called out, low and cautious, "Evening, is anyone home?" The widow's voice was steady, controlled, but firm.
Ow!
"Who wants to know?" The figure stepped closer, revealing himself as one of the townsmen, a stranger whose intentions were unclear. There was an edge to his movements, a careful calculation in the way he approached. The widow did not flinch, though her mind raced, analyzing every detail, the way he shifted his weight, the glance he cast at the cabin, the hesitation in his tone. She had learned long ago that strangers could bring both opportunity and danger, and she treated each encounter with measured caution. I've heard things," the man said finally, glancing around nervously. "People talk about you living out here alone. Some say it's unusual, others are curious." The widow's eyes narrowed. "Curiosity can be dangerous," she said softly, but her voice carried an undercurrent of authority. "I take care of myself, and I ask nothing of others. If that bothers folks, it is their problem, not mine." The man hesitated, then shifted uneasily. I didn't mean no harm. Just some folks think they ought to know what a widow like you is hiding. They wonder why you've come, why you've stayed." The widow remained silent for a long moment, letting the words hang in the air. Her hand brushed the edge of the table as if gathering strength, her eyes cold and steady. She realized that the town's curiosity had grown beyond idle gossip. There were forces moving unseen, probing, testing, perhaps even threatening. Her past, which she had kept carefully contained, risked exposure tonight. The rancher's pulse quickened. He leaned forward slightly, careful not to reveal himself, knowing that any move now could either escalate or protect. He had expected her resilience, but he had not anticipated the direct challenge of outsiders approaching her door. And he understood, with a slow, sinking awareness, that whatever was about to happen could force both of them into a confrontation neither had anticipated. The stranger shifted again, clearly aware of tension in the room. I should go," he muttered, retreating a step. "I don't mean trouble, but people want answers, and sometimes I thought you should know." The widow's gaze followed him, unwavering. "Go then," she said. "Tell them nothing they do not already know. Leave me in peace." The man hesitated, looking back once more, then disappeared into the night, leaving only the whisper of the wind. The widow exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing, but the tension did not leave her. She knew that this was only the beginning. The interest from the town was more than mere curiosity. It was a challenge, a force that could not be ignored. The rancher watched her quietly, impressed by the calm authority with which she had handled the intrusion. He felt a strange mixture of admiration and unease. The widow was a puzzle he had hoped to observe in solitude, and now that puzzle was shifting, revealing edges and layers that demanded caution, attention, and understanding. He realized that the coming hours might test more than her composure. They might test his own judgment, patience, and sense of purpose. As the widow returned to her tasks, she paused by the window, glancing out at the moonlit plains. Her thoughts wandered briefly to the past, two memories she had tried to bury, and to the people she had lost along the way. Each memory carried weight, each loss a silent testament to the strength she had cultivated, yet she knew that strength alone might not be enough to face what was approaching. The whispers in town, the curiosity that had become almost tangible, hinted at consequences she could not fully anticipate. The rancher's eyes followed her every motion. He noted the subtle tension in her posture, the way she moved with both caution and confidence, and the quiet resolve that radiated from her presence. He began to see her as more than a subject of observation. She was a force of nature, resilient, intelligent, and unyielding. And he realized with a rising awareness that his own involvement could no longer be passive. The question was not if he would act, but when and how. Suddenly a sound from outside broke the heavy stillness. A low, metallic clatter, the unmistakable echo of someone moving across the porch. The widow's head snapped toward the door, her hand tightening instinctively around the edge of the table. The rancher's pulse accelerated. He remained perfectly still, sensing that this was the turning point, the moment when all observation would shift into action or confrontation. The door creaked slightly, and a shadow appeared once more. This time, it was not a messenger or a cautious stranger. This figure moved with intent, a presence that demanded attention, that carried a sense of purpose. The widow rose slowly, placing herself between the fire and the doorway. Her eyes narrowed, her posture defensive but unyielding. She did not speak, letting the quiet authority of her stance convey her warning. The shadow hesitated, then stepped forward, revealing the faint outline of a man whose features were obscured by the night. He paused at the threshold, silent, watching, assessing. The widow's eyes held his, unwavering, and for a moment the world seemed suspended. The plains, the cabin, the wind outside, all holding their breath. The rancher realized that the tension had reached its peak. The quiet, controlled balance of observation was no longer enough. Every instinct, every lesson from the land, every subtle judgment would be tested in the moments to come. He felt the weight of anticipation, the danger of unknown intentions, and the pull of forces he could not yet control. The widow's mind raced. She knew that this encounter would not be ordinary, that the evening's intrusions were not random. Someone had sought her out, someone who knew or suspected more than she was willing to reveal. and yet she would not falter. She had survived storms, loss, and suspicion before, and she would survive this too. Her heart beat steadily, her eyes sharp, and her hands ready for any movement necessary. The figure in the doorway shifted slightly, revealing a hint of recognition, or perhaps a challenge. The widow held her ground, waiting, measuring. The rancher's heart raced in tandem with the rising tension, knowing that whatever happened next could change everything. Outside, the wind rose, sweeping across the plains with a sudden force, carrying with it the promise of revelation, confrontation, and perhaps danger. Inside, two lives remained poised at the edge of collision, the widow ready to defend her life and dignity, and the rancher observing, knowing that the story was about to shift in ways neither could fully predict. And in that dim, candlelit cabin where shadows flickered and silence stretched taut, the night seemed to hold its breath. The tension had built to a point where any word, any movement, could trigger a cascade of events that would expose secrets, test courage, and reveal truths long buried. Both the widow and the rancher were aware of the stakes, yet neither could anticipate the full consequences of the moment's unfolding, leaving the story suspended, hanging on the edge of revelation, as the plains outside whispered their silent warning. The tension in the cabin seemed to crack with the quiet sound of a falling branch outside, and for a moment, time slowed. The widow and the man at the door measured each other, every heartbeat stretched like a taut rope. Then, in a voice low but steady, the stranger spoke again. "I only came to deliver a message." His eyes flicked nervously, toward the shadows in the corner, and "I think you should know that not everyone in town wishes you well." The widow's gaze never wavered. "I know," she said softly. "But I've learned that words are lighter than actions. If people act, I will respond. If not, I continue as I have." There was strength in her calm, a confidence born of hardship and survival. The rancher, still leaning quietly in his corner, felt a surge of admiration. She was more than he had anticipated, a woman whose courage was steady, whose wisdom had been forged in the fires of loss. The stranger hesitated, then took a step back, lowering his voice even further. "I was told you might be in danger. Some folks in town, they think you hold something they want. I don't know the whole story, but they want to find out before it's too late." He looked at her, then toward the rancher's shadowed corner, and something unspoken passed between the three of them, recognition that the night's events had shifted the balance of power and understanding. The widow exhaled slowly, letting the tension leave her shoulders in tiny increments. "I hold nothing that belongs to anyone but myself," she said, her voice firm. "And if they seek trouble, they will find none that I do not meet with resolve." The stranger nodded, understanding the resolve he faced, then turned and disappeared into the night, leaving the cabin in a deep, echoing quiet. The rancher finally moved, rising from his corner with careful, measured steps. The widow turned slightly, aware of the presence she had ignored for so long, but she did not step back or hesitate. There was no fear in her posture, only curiosity tempered by caution. The rancher's voice was low, but carried the weight of honesty. "I've watched you for more than a day," he said, "not to frighten you, not to interfere. I wanted to see who you are when no one else is looking, and I've seen enough to know. You are remarkable." The widow studied him for a long moment. "You've been in my home without my knowledge," she said carefully, "and yet you claim admiration. Why?" He stepped closer, hands relaxed, tone steady. "Because it's rare to find someone who carries strength and kindness in equal measure, someone who survives, not by harming others, but by staying true to themselves. You've endured more than most, and yet you haven't hardened into bitterness. That deserves respect." For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was heavy with unspoken understanding. The widow's heart, long guarded, felt the cautious stirrings of trust, tempered by the reality of the outside world. The rancher, for his part, felt the weight of the story he had observed, the struggles, the resilience, and the quiet dignity that could not be faked or forced. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Then you see what I have built here," she said, her voice softer now. "It's not much, but it's mine. And I will defend it just as I have defended my life and my choices all these years." The rancher smiled faintly. "I understand. I will help, if you allow it. Not as a master of land or wealth, but as someone who has seen the truth of your strength and sometimes strength needs allies, even if only to stand by quietly. The widow considered his words carefully, the long years of solitude weighing against the possibility of trust. She sensed no pretense in him, no hidden agenda beyond respect and understanding. "Very well," she said at last. "But no, this any aid you offer is yours to give, and any choice I make will remain my own." The tension in the room eased slightly, replaced by a cautious connection. A quiet understanding that each respected the other's autonomy. Outside, the plains stretched endlessly, the wind rustling the tall grasses, as if acknowledging the shift. The dangers of the town, the whispers, and the potential threats were still there. But the widow no longer faced them entirely alone. And the rancher, who had come to observe, now realized that his role was not just to watch, but to act alongside someone whose strength matched his own in unexpected ways. The fire flickered low, casting warm light across the cabin. The widow moved to pour water into a small tin cup, offering it to the rancher without a word. He accepted it, and for a brief moment, the simple act carried more meaning than any conversation. It was a gesture of trust, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had begun to form between them. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the wind, the distant calls of livestock, the gentle creak of the cabin settling. Each sound reminded them of the world outside, of the challenges yet to come, and the truths that had been revealed through observation and endurance. The widow felt the weight of her past, but also the faint stirrings of hope, a realization that she did not have to face every threat alone. The rancher felt the gravity of what he had witnessed, understanding that wealth and power were meaningless compared to the integrity and resilience of a human life lived honestly. Hours passed, and the night deepened. The widow finally settled beside the fire, her mind calmer but alert. She glanced toward the rancher, sensing that the silent test was over, replaced by an alliance that neither could have anticipated. "Psh! I suppose you will leave in the morning?" she asked quietly. "No, not yet. There is more to consider. And now I am here because I choose to be. Because I see the value of standing with someone who refuses to be broken, and I have learned more from watching you than I ever expected." A small smile tugged at the widow's lips, a rare moment of relief and acknowledgement. She had spent so long protecting herself, guarding every aspect of her life, and yet in this quiet cabin, with the wind whispering across the plains and the fire flickering low, she felt a sense of possibility. It's not certainty, but possibility. Recognition that life, though harsh, could offer moments of connection, trust, and understanding. The rancher leaned back, feeling the quiet weight of the night settle around them. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to touch the horizon, brushing the sky with pale light that promised a new day. The widow, watching the faint glow, felt the tension of the past few days begin to lift, replaced by cautious optimism. The town's whispers, the intrusions, the potential threats, they remained, but they no longer carried the same immediate weight. She had faced them with courage and emerged with dignity and tact, and the rancher, who had arrived to test and observe, realized that the greatest lesson of all was not what he had expected to find. It was not a question of honesty or curiosity, but of resilience, integrity, and the quiet strength that comes from enduring life's trials without losing oneself. In that small cabin, amidst the plains and the whispers of the wind, he understood that some truths could only be seen, never fully spoken, and that the courage to stand alone and sometimes together was the measure of true character. As the light of morning grew brighter, the widow moved to open the door, letting the fresh air sweep into the cabin. The rancher followed, standing beside her, both of them watching the plains stretch endlessly before them. There was a sense of calm, tempered by awareness of the challenges ahead. The story of the town, the threats, and the whispers would continue, but for the first time in a long while, the widow did not face them alone. And the rancher had learned that observation and patience could lead to understanding, that respect and courage were more valuable than wealth, and that sometimes the most remarkable strength was found in the quiet, steadfast endurance of a single human life. The plains were quiet, save for the wind and distant calls of life beginning anew. The widow and the rancher stood together, neither claiming dominance nor demanding recognition, but both aware of a bond forged in the tension of the night. And though the world beyond would continue to test them, the lessons of trust, courage, the power of observing truth would guide them forward, leaving behind the whispers, the fear, and the doubt. Doubt in the end, it was not wealth, curiosity, or power that mattered. It was honesty, resilience, and the quiet, unshakable strength that had brought them to this moment of understanding and possibility. The wind carried their silent acknowledgement across the plains, a promise that life, no matter how harsh or uncertain, could be faced with dignity, courage, and the assurance that some connections, once made, endure beyond the trials of any night, any town, or any whisper. And as the sun rose fully over the horizon, the cabin, the plains, and the quiet figures standing together bore witness to a story concluded not with spectacle, but with the quiet triumph of trust, understanding, and human resilience.